On a quiet summer morning in Harlem, a man who had ruled the streets for decades sat down for breakfast, knowing it might be the last meal of his life. No bodyguards at his side, no speeches prepared, just a cup of black coffee, a folded newspaper, and a heart that was already failing him. His name was Bumpy Johnson, and on that day, the most powerful mafia family in America was coming to see him. What they wanted would decide the future of Harlem. What he would say would turn his final moments into legend. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson was more than a name. He was an institution. For over 30 years, he had controlled Harlem's underground world, not through chaos, but through rules. Gambling was allowed. The numbers ran every day. But one thing never crossed the line. Heroin. As long as Bumpy Johnson was alive, that poison stayed out of his neighborhood. People respected him for that. Some feared him. Many loved him. And all of them knew one thing. When Bumpy spoke, Harlem listened. But time was catching up to him. He was sick. His heart was weak. Doctors had warned him to slow down, to step away, to rest. He ignored them, because men like Bumpy didn't walk away from responsibility. They carried it until the end, and the mafia knew it. The Genovese family, one of the most powerful crime families in New York, had been waiting patiently, waiting for Bumpy to weaken, waiting for Harlem to be leaderless, waiting for their chance. That chance came on a single morning at Wells Restaurant, a small Harlem diner where Bumpy had eaten breakfast for years. Same booth, same seat, same routine. That morning, 3 men in sharp suits walked through the door. They weren't from Harlem. Everyone in the room could feel it. These men came with money, influence, and a message from the mafia. They believed they could buy what bullets couldn't take. What happened next wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no threats, just an offer placed on the table. Cash, power, a deal that would secure Bumpy's family, his future, and his comfort in his final days. All he had to do was step aside and let the mafia bring heroin into Harlem. For most men, that choice would be easy. For Bumpy Johnson, it was impossible, because this wasn't just about business. It was about legacy, about children growing up on those streets, about whether Harlem would remain a community or become a marketplace for addiction and death. The men across from him thought they were negotiating with an old, tired gangster. They were wrong. They were sitting across from a man who had already made peace with death. No one in that restaurant knew they were witnessing history. No one knew that the words spoken at that table would be repeated for generations. No one knew that within minutes, Harlem would lose its king and gain a legend. What Bumpy Johnson said to the mafia that morning didn't just end a meeting. It sealed his fate. And when the news of his death spread through Harlem, something incredible happened. Thousands of people poured into the streets. 5,000 souls came to his funeral. Not politicians, not mob buses, ordinary people, families, workers, neighbors, people who believed he had protected them when no one else would. But here's the question that still echoes today. What exactly did Bumpy Johnson say in those final moments that made the mafia walk away and an entire community stand up in mourning? That answer comes next. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was before that morning at Wells Restaurant. He wasn't born powerful. He wasn't born feared. He came from the South, from poverty, from a world where survival came before respect. Harlem didn't hand him authority. He earned it step by step, mistake by mistake, deal by deal. And over time, people began to see that he wasn't just another gangster. He was a man who drew lines and stood by them. In the 1930s and 40s, Harlem was crowded with ambition. Gangs fought for corners, numbers runners competed for customers, and outside crime families watched closely, waiting to move in. Bumpy understood something others didn't. Control didn't come from chaos. It came from balance. He worked with powerful people when he had to, pushed back when he needed to, and always made sure Harlem stayed Harlem. That's why shop owners felt safe. That's why musicians, politicians, and everyday families knew his name. The mafia knew it too. They had crossed paths with Bumpy before, and those encounters never ended the way they expected. He didn't bow easily. He didn't scare easily. And most importantly, he didn't sell out his neighborhood for quick money. That reputation followed him into old age. Even as his health declined, His presence still carried weight. A word from Bumpy could calm a block or stop a problem before it started. By the late 1960s, the streets were changing. Younger hustlers didn't care about old rules. Drugs were spreading fast in other neighborhoods, making fortunes overnight. The Mafia saw Harlem as unfinished business. To them, Bumpy Johnson was the final obstacle, not because he had armies, but because people still listened to him. And influence is more dangerous than force. That's why they didn't send threats. They sent suits. They sent smiles. They sent money. They believed age and illness had softened him. They believed a dying man would think about comfort, not consequences. What they didn't understand was that Bumpy had already lived his life. What he cared about now wasn't how long he had left. It was what would happen after he was gone. Inside Wells' restaurant, while coffee cooled and plates sat untouched, a quiet battle was unfolding. Not a battle of weapons, but of values. On one side, a powerful organization that measured everything in profit. On the other, a man who measured his life by what he refused to allow. The people watching from their tables didn't hear the words, but they felt the tension. Harlem had a way of sensing when something important was happening. Outside, Bumpy's men waited, uneasy. They trusted his instincts, but they also knew his body was failing him. Every minute felt heavy. Every glance at the diner window carried fear. Not fear of the Mafia, fear of losing the one man who had held everything together for so long. And inside that booth, with his heart already betraying him, Bumpy Johnson was being pushed toward a decision that would define him forever. A decision that would either open Harlem's doors to destruction or slam them shut one final time. The offer was on the table. The future was hanging in the balance. And the words Bumpy was about to speak would change everything, for the men sitting across from him, and for Harlem itself. The men across from Bumpy studied him closely, each seeing something different. One saw an old man clinging to habits. Another saw a legend standing in the way of progress. The youngest saw a future that could be his if this deal went through. None of them saw what Bumpy felt in that moment, the weight of memory pressing harder than the pain in his chest. Every face he'd ever protected, every promise he'd ever made, every line he'd refused to cross. To them, Harlem was numbers on a page. A market, a place where supply would meet demand whether anyone liked it or not. They spoke calmly, carefully choosing their words, framing everything as business. They talked about changing times, about inevitability, about how control was better than chaos. They said this was the only way to keep things orderly once Bumpy was gone. What they didn't say, what hung in the air, was that once they stepped in, Harlem would never truly belong to itself again. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He'd spent his life learning when silence was more powerful than speech. He noticed how confident they were, how sure they seemed that the world moved only in one direction. He also noticed how none of them were from Harlem. None of them had grown up on these streets. None of them had watched neighbors disappear or families fall apart. They spoke about the future like observers, not caretakers. Across the room, the waitress pretended not to watch, but she'd served Bumpy for years. She knew his moods, his rhythms. Something felt wrong. Not just tense, final. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. Conversation stayed low. Folks paused halfway to mouths. Everyone sensed that whatever was happening in that booth mattered far beyond that morning. Outside, his men shifted in their seats, watching the door, checking their watches. They trusted Bumpy's mind, but they worried about his body. He'd brushed off their concern earlier, told them not to make a scene. Still, they stayed close. Harlem had learned the hard way what happened when it let its guard down. Inside the booth, the pressure grew. The offer didn't change, but the meaning behind it did. This wasn't just a proposal anymore. It was a test. Would Bumpy Johnson become another man who softened at the end? Another name remembered for what he took instead of what he stood for? Or would he remain exactly who Harlem believed him to be? The youngest man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the briefcase, then back at Bumpy. He'd heard stories growing up, stories about respect, about fear, about a man who never bent. Sitting here now, those stories felt uncomfortably real. This wasn't how deals usually went. There was no rush, no threats, no raised voices. Just time ticking away, each second tightening the moment. And beneath it all was the unspoken truth both sides understood. This meeting wasn't really about money. It was about permission. about whether the future will be shaped quietly, with consent, or forced through once the old guard was gone. What Bumpy chose to say next wouldn't just affect him. It would echo through Harlem long after this breakfast ended. The room stayed still. The office stayed open. And Bumpy Johnson, breathing slower now, sat at the center of it all, holding Harlem's fate in words he had not yet spoken. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. It wasn't awkward, but heavy, like the air before a storm. The men from the Mafia waited, confident on the surface, but growing uneasy underneath. Deals usually moved faster than this. Money talked. Power decided. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't playing by their rules, and that made everything unpredictable. Bumpy sat still, hands resting on the table, eyes steady. Inside, his chest tightened again, sharper this time. He ignored it. Pain had been part of his life for years, physical and otherwise. What mattered now was clarity. He thought about Harlem in the early mornings, when shopkeepers lifted their gates and kids ran down the sidewalks. He thought about mothers who trusted that their blocks were safe enough to raise families. He thought about how fragile all of that really was. One of the men leaned back slightly, trying to ease the tension with a softer tone. He spoke about order, about keeping things controlled. He said that if they didn't step in, others would. Worse ones. He framed the offer as protection, as a way to manage the future instead of fighting it. It was a careful argument, rehearsed and polished, the kind designed to sound reasonable. Bumpy nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. He had heard this logic before, dressed up in different words across different decades. Every time, it led to the same place. Lines erased, rules bent, communities paying the price while outsiders counted profits. The men across from him spoke about inevitability, but Bumpy believed in choices. He believed that what you allowed mattered just as much as what you stopped. The youngest man glanced around the restaurant again. He noticed the photos on the walls, the way people pretended not to stare. He felt like an outsider in a room that didn't belong to him. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not about the deal, but about the man sitting across from him. This wasn't someone waiting to be replaced. This was someone anchoring everything in place. Outside, a car door slammed. Bumpy's men shifted closer to the entrance, their instincts sharp. They couldn't hear the words inside, but they could feel the tension radiating through the glass. One of them checked his watch again. Something was wrong. Not with the meeting, with time itself. Like it was running out faster than anyone expected. Back in the booth, the briefcase sat untouched. The money might as well have been invisible. The men waited for Bumpy to speak, to ask a question, to negotiate. Anything. Instead, he looked past them, toward the front door, as if measuring how far his influence truly reached. Harlem wasn't just streets and buildings. It was memory, loyalty, identity. And those things didn't disappear just because someone decided the future should look different. His breathing slowed, then caught for a moment. He adjusted slightly in his seat, unnoticed by most, but not by the man sitting closest to him. Something flickered across that man's face. Concern, maybe even fear. This meeting was drifting somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Bumpy finally leaned forward just a little. The movement was small, but it pulled everyone in. Whatever he was about to say would matter. The offer was still on the table. The pressure was at its peak. And in that quiet Harlem diner, with history watching from every corner, the moment before the words felt louder than anything that came before it. Bumpy's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table as he leaned in, just enough for the men across from him to sense a shift. The room seemed to tighten with him. One of the suits opened his mouth to speak again, then stopped. He realized this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a moment, and moments like this didn't come twice. Before Bumpy could say anything, a soft but sudden pain rolled through his chest, stronger than before. He masked it with a slow breath, eyes steady, face calm. Years of control had taught him how to hide weakness. Still, the man closest to him noticed a pause, the fraction of a second where Bumpy's gaze drifted. Something was happening, and it wasn't part of the plan. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather without meaning to. Word traveled fast in Harlem, even without words. People passing by slowed when they saw unfamiliar cars, unfamiliar faces, and Bumpy's men standing alert near the entrance. A few shop owners stepped outside. A couple of older men leaned against a wall across the street. Nobody knew exactly why they were there. They just felt they should be. Back inside, one of the visitors tried a different approach. His voice softened, almost respectful. He spoke about legacy, about how history forgets details and only remembers results. He suggested that Bumpy's name could live on as a man who adapted, who made sure Harlem stayed relevant in a changing world. It was clever, dangerous, even, because for a split second, it sounded reasonable. Bumpy's eyes lifted slowly. There was no anger in them, only disappointment. That reaction unsettled him more than shouting ever could. He had expected pressure. He had expected persuasion. What he hadn't expected was how little time he suddenly felt he had left. His heartbeat felt uneven now, like it was stumbling over itself. He knew that feeling. He'd felt it before, late at night, alone, when no one was watching. The youngest man shifted again, uneasy. He wasn't thinking about money anymore. He was thinking about what it would mean to walk out of this place with a yes. What it would mean to come back years later and see Harlem change forever. He wondered if this was how history turned. Not with noise, but with quiet decisions made over coffee. Then something else changed. The waitress approached the booth, pretending to refill a glass, her hand shaking just enough to notice. She didn't look at the men in suits. She looked at Bumpy. Their eyes met for half a second. In that look was concern, respect, and fear. Not fear of what might happen, fear of what already was. Bumpy gave her a small nod, as if to say it was all right. But the gesture cost him more than it showed. His breathing grew heavier, though he kept his shoulders square. The men across from him sensed it now. This wasn't just tension. This was time closing in. Outside, one of Bumpy's men stepped closer to the door, peering in. He didn't like what he saw. Bumpy wasn't moving the way he normally did. The confidence was there, but the strength looked thinner, stretched. He reached for the handle, then stopped. Bumpy had told them not to interfere. And in Harlem, you followed Bumpy's word. Back at the table, the briefcase seemed heavier than ever, like it carried more than money. It carried consequences. The men waited, unsure whether to push or pull back. They hadn't planned for this version of the meeting. They hadn't planned for a dying man who wasn't afraid to let them see it. Bumpy drew in a slow breath, his chest tight, his thoughts clear. Whatever he said next wouldn't just decide the deal. It would decide how this moment was remembered, as the day Harlem bent, or the day it drew its final line. And as he prepared to speak, with the entire room unknowingly leaning toward him, one truth settled deep in his bones. There would be no middle ground. Bumpy finally spoke, and his voice was calm, almost gentle, which made the words land even harder. He didn't raise it. He didn't threaten. He simply told them they were mistaken if they believed Harlem was just another place to claim. He said some neighborhoods survive because people protect them, not because outsiders decide they are profitable. He told them that as long as he was alive, certain lines would not be crossed. One of the men tried to interrupt, but Bumpy lifted a hand, stopping him without effort. He said he understood the offer. He understood the money, the power, the logic behind it. Then he said something that none of them expected. He told them he already knew this meeting would likely be his last. That silence fell instantly. The room shifted. What had felt like strategy now felt personal. He leaned forward slightly, his breathing heavier now, but his eyes sharp. He told them he wasn't afraid of dying. What he was afraid of was leaving Harlem unprotected by silence. He said that taking their deal would mean living a few more months while watching his neighborhood fall apart from the inside. And that, to him, wasn't living at all. Then he said the words that ended everything. He told them they would bring nothing into Harlem with his permission. Not today. Not later. Not quietly. He told them that even after he was gone, Harlem would remember who tried to buy it and who refused to sell it. And then, looking each man in the eye, he said the line that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Harlem doesn't bow. Not now. Not ever. That's when his body gave out. The pain hit him hard and fast. His hand went to his chest as his coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. The sound snapped the room back into motion. The waitress screamed for help. Chairs scraped. Someone rushed toward the door. Panic spread, sharp and sudden. Bumpy's men burst inside moments later. They saw him struggling to breathe, so the suit still sitting there, frozen. For a brief, dangerous second, the room felt like it might explode. Accusations hung unspoken. Fear flashed across the visitors' faces as they realized how this looked. History didn't care about truth. It cared about timing. One of Bumpy's men stepped forward, anger barely contained. But through the pain, Bumpy lifted his hand again. This time it shook. His voice was weaker, but his authority was still there. He told them to let the visitors go. The order stunned everyone. Even now, he was controlling the outcome. The men from the Mafia didn't hesitate. They stood quickly, grabbed the briefcase, and moved toward the door. They didn't look back. Outside, they rushed into their car and drove away, knowing that staying even a second longer could cost them everything. The deal was dead, not postponed. Dead. Inside the restaurant, all attention turned back to Bumpy. People gathered around him, strangers and friends alike. Someone called for an ambulance. The waitress held his hand, tears streaming down her face. Bumpy looked up at her and managed a small smile. He said he was sorry for the trouble. Then he closed his eyes. Minutes later, Harlem lost its king. The news spread fast, faster than anyone expected. By the end of the day, the streets were filled with quiet disbelief. By the time of his funeral, over 5,000 people came to honor him. Not because he was perfect, but because he stood firm when it mattered most. The unexpected twist came later. The briefcase of money he had refused was never spent. Years afterward, it was quietly returned to Harlem, untouched. Proof that the offer had been real, and that Bumpy Johnson's refusal had been final. The conflict ended that morning, but the impact didn't. Harlem changed, as all places do, but it never forgot the day a dying man chose his people over comfort and reminded the world that some things cannot be bought. In the days after Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem moved differently. The streets were still loud, still busy, but there was a weight in the air that people couldn't explain. Shop owners talked in low voices. Old men lingered longer on stoops. Even the young ones, who only knew Bumpy as a name, sensed that something important had ended. It wasn't just the loss of a man. It was a loss of a presence that had shaped daily life for decades. Questions spread quickly. People wanted to know what really happened at Wells' restaurant. They wanted to know what the Mafia had offered him, what he had said, and why those men left in such a hurry. Stories traveled faster than facts. Some said they had been shouting. Others swore there was almost no sound at all. But everyone agreed on one thing. Bumpy Johnson had not backed down. Not at the end. Not when it mattered most. His funeral became something Harlem had never seen before. More than 5,000 people came, lining the streets for blocks. There were no flashy displays, no grand speeches filled with exaggeration. Just quiet respect. People from every walk of life showed up. Church leaders, musicians, shopkeepers, mothers holding children by the hand. Men who had once crossed the street when they saw Bumpy now stood with their heads lowered, paying respects to a man they understood only in hindsight. What surprised outsiders was who didn't show up. No major Mafia figures appeared. No bold claims. No attempt to take control that day. It was as if an invisible boundary had been drawn, and no one wanted to be the first to step over it. Bumpy Johnson was gone, but his shadow was still there, stretching across Harlem. In the months that followed, the Genovese family and other outside groups tested the ground carefully. Small moves, quiet feelers, nothing bold, nothing open. They had learned something that morning at Wells' restaurant. Power didn't always come from force. Sometimes it came from reputation, memory, and the loyalty of a community. And those things couldn't be taken overnight. Harlem did change. That was inevitable. Younger hustlers rose up, some with less patience for old rules. Drugs found their way in eventually, despite everything Bumpy had tried to prevent. That truth is uncomfortable, but it matters. Bumpy didn't stop history. He slowed it. He made it harder. He forced anyone who came after him to cross lines knowing they were crossing them. Years later, when the story of the black leather briefcase surfaced, it reopened old conversations. The money Bumpy refused had stayed untouched, hidden away as if it carried a lesson no one wanted to forget. When it was finally returned to Harlem, quietly and without publicity, people understood what it meant. It wasn't about the cash. It was proof Proof that the offer had been real. Proof that his refusal hadn't been symbolic. Proof that, in his final moments, Bumpy Johnson had chosen principle over comfort. That detail changed how people talked about him. Not as a gangster who happened to do some good, but as a complicated man who understood the cost of his choices. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't clean. But he was consistent. And consistency, in a world built on compromise, is rare. The waitress from Wells' restaurant told her version of the story years later. She said the thing she remembered most wasn't the collapse or the panic. It was a look in his eyes before he spoke. Calm, certain, like a man who had already accepted the outcome. She said he looked relieved, as if saying no had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for years. Bumpy's men went their separate ways over time. Some tried to keep his rules alive. Some drifted. Some made mistakes. But none of them ever forgot that morning. They measured every decision against it. They asked themselves what Bumpy would have allowed, and what he wouldn't. Even when they failed, the question mattered. Today, Wells' restaurant is gone. The booth is gone. The corner looks like any other city block. But the story remains. It's told on stoops, in barbershops, at family dinners. It changes a little with each telling, but the heart of it stays the same. A dying man, a powerful offer, a refusal that echoed longer than gunshots ever could. Bumpy Johnson's legacy isn't found in police records or headlines. It's found in memory, in the idea that leadership isn't just about control, but about restraint. That power isn't proven by what you take, but by what you refuse. That even in the final moments of life, choice still matters. That's why 5,000 people came to his funeral. Not because he was flawless, but because he stood firm when it would have been easy to give in. Because he reminded a community that it had worth beyond money. Because he showed that dignity doesn't disappear just because time is running out. Harlem kept moving forward, as it always does. New generations grew up. New challenges came. But the story of Bumpy Johnson's final words stayed alive, passed down as a reminder that history isn't only shaped by winners and losers, but by those rare moments when someone chooses a harder path. In the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't just leave behind a name. He left behind a standard. And whether people lived up to it or not, they remembered it was there. That is why his story still matters. That is why his final stand is still told. And that is why, decades later, people still repeat the word he left behind. Harlem doesn't bow.